Jeez! Oh, jeez! What the crap? Oh my gosh! Super intimidating. I got your skin too now. I'm lacking some serious brain functionality.
christiangeekcentral.com. Do you like games? I like games too. I like games too.
Hey guys, Peter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to part 14 of my bookshelf tour. We've been in the video game section of my bookshelf for a while, and we're going to maybe wrap that up this time. I am giving myself, this time, 15 minutes on the clock instead of merely 10, and we'll see how much I have to say about what's on my bookshelf in that amount of time, starting now. Alright, so we left off, I was about to talk about Neverwinter Nights 2. I really enjoyed the original Neverwinter Nights. It was a BioWare game. It was the game that made me just really take note of anything BioWare was doing from that point on. Neverwinter Nights 2 was shopped out to, I believe it was Obsidian, or the people that would become Obsidian Entertainment, who've made now since then Pillars of Eternity and other games like that. And it was, I guess it kind of came out a little bit buggy and stuff like that. I didn't play the game until years after it was released and had patches to help those things out. There were still some things about it that I guess I didn't like quite as much, but I liked the update in the graphics. I think maybe the main thing was that there weren't as many modules by far made for Neverwinter Nights 2 as for Neverwinter Nights. I think also I didn't like necessarily controlling an entire party. There was something simple and streamlined about the original Neverwinter Nights where you control one guy and then you have AI-controlled companions, one, maybe two, something like that. And in this game, I think you can have a party of up to 6. And I wasn't always in the mood to like control all of them, which, and I think there were some AI scripts that you could assign to them. But anyway, there was something, even though there was some nice upgrades there was something that didn't quite capture me the same way that the original Neverwinter Nights did. That's the last game on my bookshelf, but we're still in the gaming section talking about strategy guides now. I got a big old stack of strategy guides. I remember back in the day, I think maybe especially if you are an RPG gamer. I mean, I don't know, I didn't play really any other kind of game for a lot of the NES, Super NES, and original PlayStation, and even PlayStation 2 era, so I wouldn't know what to compare it to. But I collected strategy guides. Every time I bought a new JRPG, I made sure if the strategy guide was available, which it usually was because I usually bought them new or close to it, I would get the strategy guide, because the way they were designed back then, they didn't have quest markers or quest logs, and you could sometimes just get lost in terms of knowing what am I supposed to do next. And I think even maybe more than that, I didn't want to miss anything. This was before open world games, like Oblivion and Skyrim. I mean, I guess around the same time, or shortly after that era, there was Morrowind. But, those big open world games, you almost can't do it all. Sometimes you can't because it's procedurally generated and it just has infinite content that keeps, respawning or whatever. But at this time in the PlayStation era and the PlayStation 2 era and, SNES and NES era, you could get everything if you knew where to find it. But sometimes the puzzles were so obscure, like the things you would have to... Man, some of these games... I don't know how you would be expected to know to find this thing. You would have to almost find it by pure chance. I remember especially with Final Fantasy XII, there were some out-of-the-way bosses and special hunts that you could do where the only way to find this boss and stumble across it is literally to do something like run back and forth 7 times, or is some weird thing like that you could only have any reason to do if a strategy guide told you to. So I think at some point they even designed games in order to sell strategy guides. But anyway, I've got the strategy guide for a lot of Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy Origins, which includes 1 and 2, meaning the Japan 2. Anthology, which includes 4 and 5 as they're numbered in Japan. And then I've got the Super Nintendo Final Fantasy 3 strategy guide. And then for PlayStation, I've got the Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 guides. And for PlayStation 2, the Final Fantasy 12 guides. Oh, those bring back a lot of great memories of just having that thing open in my lap, while I'm playing the game. And I did try to avoid spoilers, and a good strategy guide wouldn't tell you kind of plot spoilers. It would just tell you go here and then watch a cutscene or whatever, But anyway, I've got the strategy guide for Chrono Trigger, which that was really helpful because it has a boatload of endings, and you can blow through that game pretty quickly. But to get all of the endings, the strategy guide was really helpful. I don't think I ever did go back and get all of them. I think I got maybe 2 or 3 more, something like that. But I don't think I quite got all. There was a bug that kept me from getting one of them. Anyway, I've got the strategy guide for Super Mario Brothers 3, which I wouldn't have bothered with, but I had cheat codes to help me get through all that. More on that in a little bit. But it was just kind of cool to know where you could get the Tanuki Mario suits and stuff. And I think that might have also come with a subscription to Nintendo Power, which I didn't have at the time. But anyway, and then Castlevania Symphony of the Night for the PlayStation 1. That was really handy. In fact, recently I was playing Chasm and thinking, man, I'd really like a strategy guide for this. But Chasm, the layout is kind of procedurally generated, and so I don't know. I think even if there, were a strategy guide out there, which I'm sure there is, it might be hard to know what to look for. And so anyway, but that's a handy game to have a strategy guide for, especially if you don't know about the castle flip, which it would be understandable if you missed that. And I think I would have if I didn't have that strategy guide. So, and then getting out of strategy guides, but kind of the last thing in that strategy guide department, I printed out some maps. The first one was for Far Cry 2, and this actually isn't the entire. There's like 2 maps. There's another one that I can't find it right now, but I printed out all the locations of all the diamonds because this game was the Far Cry game that didn't have. Well, I'm trying to think if they did it in 3. I think at some point Ubisoft started making it possible for you to just see on their maps all the stuff that you can go and collect. And so you can know, I'm going to get these collectibles, here's where they are, all I got to do is look on the map and then go to that spot, But they hadn't done that yet in their game design with Far Cry 2, but I really enjoyed that whole collectathon of Ubisoft, and so I, much more recently than using those other strategy guides, printed out maps with all the diamond locations for Far Cry 2, and that just added so much replay value to that game. I mean, you might say the same thing, Peter, well, imagine how many hours you could have gotten out of Final Fantasy whatever if you hadn't used a strategy guide. Yeah, but that would have been hours and hours of trial and error, of just like monotonously going around, and maybe that's somebody else's idea of fun, and I tip my hat and congratulate them to enjoy that, but that is not my idea of a good time. But this sure was, and I just loved meticulously going through each of these areas and crossing off each of the diamonds as I picked them up, and then crossing off that whole section of the map so I could move on to the next one. There's something about that completionist, kind of thing that was, loved checking those boxes. And I did print out a map for the Elder Scrolls 4. Is it 4? Yeah, 4, Oblivion, because there's so many locations to find on there, and I wish that there was a way there, in the Fallout, I think Fallout 3 and maybe in New Vegas, there's a perk you can get that unlocks all the locations on the map so that you can, know which ones you've been to and which ones you haven't, and I don't know if there's a way to do that, even with mods, in Oblivion and Skyrim, without, having them grayed out until you go and visit them so that you can kind of keep track of which ones you've been to and which ones you haven't. But anyway, still so many hours I'm sure I could get out of Oblivion. But anyway, so that's the end of my strategy guides and strategy helps type of section of my bookshelf. Now we get on to, where's that folder? Where's my beloved folder? Here it is. This, my blue folder, which I've had this blue folder since college, and gosh, what does it even say? It says codes, just says codes in my crappy handwriting. And these are pages and pages and pages of codes that I printed from the internet, so that I could have them, in the laundry room where I played video games. We didn't have a computer in the laundry room, didn't have smartphones to look up these codes and stuff like that. So this was in the early days of infancy of the internet, and I just printed out tons and tons of codes for my Game Genie at first, both for my NES Game Genie and my Super NES Game Genie. I remember originally the only way to get new codes for that was either experiment and get really lucky, which never happened for me, or to order them from like mail order, these little extra booklets or whatever of codes that you could get. But when the internet arrived, I went back and revisited a whole bunch of NES games because there were all these codes that other people had discovered that suddenly I could use in my games, and so I printed them all out. And maybe I'll just go through some of my favorites here. Honestly, I'm a big cheater. I'm a big cheater in games, and I have no shame in saying that. I honestly don't understand the rationale of some folks that are part of like the get good thing, I mean, I understand that some people, that's fun for them to like want to get good at a game, and maybe they're wanting me to have that fun experience, but there are other people that use that phrase that, man, I worry that their self-worth is subtly tied up in that a bit. But anyway, I have no problems with cheating. Holy crap. Let's reminisce with some of my favorite codes and games that I played codes with. Bionic Commando. Oh man, that game is a pain in the butt for me to play without codes. I would go for infinite lives because of the pitfalls. No damage, like invincibility basically. I could still get knocked around, which still added some challenge to the platforming and stuff. It was discouraging enough for me to get high up somewhere and then get knocked over and have to fall all the way back down. So there was still, for my skill level, enough challenge left for me in having to deal with that. But man, really enjoyed that game. Super Mario Brothers 2. Now, if I don't specify, all of these games I'm using infinite lives, infinite health, and if there's a timer involved, infinite time. But aside from that, Super Mario Bros. 2 had this cool code that would allow the princess to have, quote, mega float and lunar descent, which means that her float, because she would jump up and just float for a while and then drop down. Well, that floating period would last a whole lot longer, and then when she would start dropping down, instead of dropping down immediately, it would be this really slow descent. And so I could just fly through a whole bunch of levels if I wanted to. And some levels that had a lot of difficult platforming, that if you failed, you'd fall into a pit and have to start back from the beginning of the level, that code was totally worth it for me to have. Even though I still enjoyed, I didn't just fly through every level, and just skip the whole level. I still liked jumping around in those levels, picking up the bad guys, throwing them around, and interacting with the game world. That's really what I enjoy in games. I don't play them for challenge. So most of the time I was still in the trenches interacting with the monsters and stuff like that, and the power-ups and whatever else was there. But to have that mega float and lunar descent when I wanted it in the stupid place where you normally have to ride a dumb flying carpet and fight enemies that could knock you off, and the carpet disappears and you fall down and you have to start the level over again. No, thank you. Let's see here. Super Mario Brothers, like the original Super Mario Brothers. There was a cool, like Mario swims all the time code, which was kind of like flying, but it still made the the little noise or whatever it is. But man, there were some weird codes. I think it's because it's been around for so long and so many people have made codes for it that people, have just discovered some weird, wacky codes for the original Super Mario Brothers. There was also like codes to make the game harder, because if you beat the game enough times, it's, because it starts you back at the beginning every time, and it's a little bit harder every time. And enemies at some point, after you've beaten it once or twice, will start throwing hammers at you. Like they all have hammers like the Hammer Brothers. Well, I found some codes to make it extra hard so that there's like a fountain of hammers, like this arc, this rainbow arc of hammers coming out of all the bad guys. It just looks insane. And I wonder, man, if I played it through that many times, is that really what would happen? Or is this just, a weird glitch brought about by the code? But anyway, yeah. And like weird levels too that you could find with codes. And I was like, is this because of the game is being manipulated through the code to create this level? Or are these like unfinished levels that were just buried in the code, and not accessed through regular play of the game? I don't know, but there was so much mystique of the original Super Mario Brothers that these codes inspired as I played around with them. Let's see here. Oh, Batman, which was one of the first, if not maybe the only NES era comic book movie adaptation game that was any good. I mean, it certainly was knocking off Ninja Gaiden quite a bit, but I still really enjoy a playthrough of that game as long as I have my, all my invincibility and stuff. Oh, and there's also a super jump code, which is kind of cool. I don't use it all the time, but let's see here. Wizards and Warriors, that was one that I could get through without playing codes, because like when you died, even if you ran out of lives and like had to continue, it would basically respawn you pretty much exactly where you had died. And so the only time that I couldn't get through the game through its own continuation system was maybe in the very last boss fight. It would sometimes be a little bit too hard, but I did eventually beat it without codes. But adding codes for like invincibility or regenerating life or whatever, it just made it a little bit easier to get through the game and not be set back, because respawning you would be set back just a little bit sometimes, and so it was still nice to made it just a little bit more of a smooth experience. Iron Tank had limited codes for it. I really enjoyed this game. Because it was like I think it was a World War II era game, but you wouldn't know it because it had all this weird sci-fi, technology type stuff, with the enemy tanks and vehicles and planes and stuff. And there was a code that was like, it said almost invincible. And so you were never sure which of the giant, monsters, or not monsters, tanks or enemy vehicles and stuff would be able to destroy you. Usually it was like the mini boss vehicles or the boss vehicles that, if they touched you, would destroy you, But other than that, you could basically, with your tank, run around and just plow through enemies, and they would just self-destruct, and it was a lot of fun. Duck Hunt this is a great code. It's an infinite ammo code. So basically, when those ducks start flying, you can just go pow, 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 until you get them. There's a liberating feeling to that. Let's see here. I'm going to finish up these codes if I can, because I want to get into a different section of my bookshelf when we pick it up next time. What else do we have here? Talked enough about Super Mario Brothers 3, I think. Let's see here. I had some stuff built in here. Death and Return of Superman. That has some codes built into it through the sound test. And if you're curious about any of these, you can just, Google what I've described them doing, and, code, Game Genie code, Game Shark code, whatever, you'll be able to find them. Death and Return of Superman, in the sound menu, it had this sound test menu where you could go through and listen to the songs, I think, and for sure the sound effects in the game, which was, it was a weird little, special feature that they put into only a few games, and so that was fun to play with. But it turns out if you play a certain selection of sounds in a certain order, then when you start your game, some codes will be in effect. And so there was one code that would allow you to be invincible, one code that would allow you to power up your power meter anytime you want, because there was a meter for every time you used your powers, which I guess makes a little bit of sense because of Superman dependent on the solar power of the sun, all that kind of stuff. But let's see here. Wrapping up now. Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2, which of course when I was a kid, not of course, maybe you didn't, but I called it Ninja Gaiden. All my friends called it Ninja Gaiden. I think even in, what's it called? The Wizard with Fred Savage. I think they even called it Ninja Gaiden in there too. I'm not sure, but anyway, those games, I loved how cinematic they were. I actually owned Ninja Gaiden 2 before I eventually went back years later, and when I rebought an NES for myself, bought the first one. But because you better believe, me buying an action game, was totally dependent on, are there the right codes for it, The codes determined what games I bought, Anyway, and they were the cinematic cutscenes for those games were so cool, and you had the different power-ups that you could use, that you could pick up along the way, and the different weapon types and special effects, and man, those were really cool games. And so I loved having the option to play through them with invincibility. Man, I think I've had to find codes for both of them so that once you get onto a new screen, if you get hit, the first time you get hit, you'll kind of like fall backwards and get bumped around or whatever. But after that, you're invincible on that screen. And I really needed that because some of the platforming got just too difficult and frustrating for me. But man, the great memories with Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2. And then finally, Final Fantasy 2, which I think is the first RPG I've mentioned on this list. I didn't play Japanese, JRPGs or any RPGs with codes, really. Because I just enjoyed them fine the way they were. But with Final Fantasy II, after completing it, I found these codes that, like, you could put the final boss of the game in your party, or there were like some spells that didn't make the final cut of the game that were hidden away in the code that you could use. And so I definitely at least played around with those codes. I love just finding stuff like that that's buried in the code that you can't access any other way, but just to know that it's there and that you could get it into the game with a code was such a cool thing. I know that PC gamers have been, doing this for years with mods, but for a console gamer, man, the Game Genie, the Game Shark, these were such like massive, quote unquote, or no pun intended, not quote unquote, game changers, for me. So really, really enjoyed that aspect of that era of gaming. I do wish that we had cheats much more commonly in games, even though many games are designed to be much more easy or have easier difficulties that you can select. That still doesn't remove all the frustrations of, say, like timed missions or insta-fail stealth missions, where if you get spotted then you instantly fail the whole mission and have to start over from the beginning or whatever. So there's still like some game design things that I'm like, man, I wish we still had cheats so that we get rid of these. I know, I hear you PC gamers. I don't want to deal with all your cards and your graphic things and your I'm not a tech nerd at all, and so I just want my video games to work without me having to do anything. All right. That's it. And my voice is already starting to fatigue on me. Next time I'm going to get into some nonfiction. I'm going to talk about some of the Bibles that I have, what translation I prefer, and do I think it's the best or not, or what do I think of other translations? I actually own multiple translations, so I'll talk about that a little bit. And then we'll get into some other, some books about sex that I've read with my boys, and some other interesting stuff in the nonfiction section of my bookshelf. We'll get to that next time. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Oh, jeez! Oh, jeez! What the crap? Oh, my gosh! Super intimidating. I got your skin too now. I'm lacking some serious brain functionality.